Welcome back from that short break. Thank you, Lenore, for sharing your research and expertise, along with highlighting the excellent work occurring at Miami-Dade College. There's so much for all of us to learn from Miami-Dade's model and approach. And thank you, Dawn, for such an energizing panel and for really making the most of every one of those 45 minutes. Christina, Hayden, Ronnie, Julian, and Kellen, your honest and thoughtful responses were so appreciated. And I think it's a conversation we can all agree really helps to ground the entire forum. I know many of you are looking forward to hearing more about the programs that the students were highlighting from faculty and staff at Piedmont Valley Community College, San Francisco State University, and Montclair State University during the concurrent sessions, which begin right at 4 o'clock Eastern Time. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Sylvia Hurtado is a professor of education at UCLA and one of the nation's leading scholars on practices that prepare students to play their own part in a highly diverse democracy. As with all of our speakers, you can find Sylvia's bio on the forum's website. Sylvia is going to present a 21st century vision for inclusive civic learning. Welcome, Sylvia.
Thank you. Here we go. So let me go ahead and go to the next slide and just talk a little bit about what's going on here. So this work actually began in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, put out a report on undergraduate education. And one of the things they did, they wanted to extend the work. And so they asked several of us, led by Sandy Baum and Michael McPherson, to write a piece and data list. So you can see the entire piece that we'll share with you. But really, I wanted to title this piece, Now is the Time. And really, when Dr. King said this phrase, it really was in a time of great civil unrest. Well, somehow I feel we're in a bit of a chaotic time where we actually have a lot to do in higher education to actually advance civic learning. So now is the time. Let me see if I can go to the next slide. All right. So like a good instructor, I will do what I do with my students is I say where we're going. A couple of things. One is, of course, the main point will be is to recenter civic learning across the curriculum. And I want to know, is civic learning optional in your college? I think for the longest time, we've developed many programs over the last decades and courses and activities, co-curricular and curricular activities. And now it's really thinking, how do we spread this? How do we grow the civic learning movement and also reach more students? So I wanted today to provide some frameworks. They're not new ones, they're in existence, but we want to kind of enliven them and develop them further in this next version of the civic learning movement that I hope this becomes. And to really thinking about how to expand civic learning so we think about multiple dimensions. Then I want to turn to a few things that I think is really important is to reach more students. We have to engage our pedagogies. We have to think about everything that we do in college from entry into the first year until graduation with any culminating experiences. So I want to talk a little bit about the pedagogies in classrooms and give you some personal examples, hopefully. So. Okay, so really, I think, thank you. That helps me and it helps everyone, I think. Where we've been, we have a long history. Campus Compact for decades have been engaging campus efforts, campus leadership, and campus planning around this issue. Around 2012, we had a great call to action with an interest in revitalizing civic learning and the promotion of civic outcomes in the report, AAC report. And at that time, we talked about addressing a civic recession. Well, now we're almost in a civic crisis, I think. So it's time for us to really do more. The U.S. Department of Education responded with 5 priorities, and among them was making civic learning and democratic engagement the core expectations for all education levels, K through 12, undergraduate, master's, and doctoral learning. And then developing robust evidence of student achievement of some of these civic learning outcomes, and then be able to record institutional impact in these. Of course, we had a change in administration, and so that report, I'm sure you hear from Martha Cantor at this conference about what happens next. So I think the CDLE is what happens next. The CLDE, rather, is what happens next. So really, and I feel passionate about this, is that events today make it more important. The lack of understanding of formal democratic processes and, of course, unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud really contributed to the January 6th event. To see that was heartbreaking, and to understand that we were really seeing a threat to our democracy. The other thing is that we know with each election, it depends on actually young voter turnout. Those are students that are typically in our colleges or college age. And we've been watching the polls at every age level, and that's an area to actually continue to increase. It has increased in recent elections, but we want to increase it more. But more than that, we want to ensure that students are not only active participants, but are equipped with the skills and knowledge to really ensure democracy's promise for all. Now, Parker Palmer, who's a favorite of mine, particularly when it comes to the pedagogy, and I'll come back and refer to him again later, is democracy is not a spectator sport where citizens can actually watch the pros. We really want people to be engaged, and young people to be engaged in particular. So together we can reinvigorate the role of higher education in securing our democracy. So I think we really are thinking about revitalizing higher education's role. So I want to turn then to really thinking about what are kind of ways we can expand the notions of civic learning. When we think of civic learning, we're also very often thinking about public action, voter participation, or engagement in community service, for example. But we really want to think about other elements that are really constitute civic learning. And Karen Musil wrote this piece, pulling together a framework, working with educators and nonprofit members as a task force to kind of build a civic learning framework to understand it better. I'm going to go through each of these, but first, before that, I want to say something about the way they conceptualize this framework, which is useful. That these different dimensions of civic learning are interdependent and integrative. They're fluid and continuous, and repetition is welcomed. That is, to be able to find elements or even activities that actually give an opportunity to learn skills, to learn values, to increase self-efficacy and agency is really important. So really, this framework is not a stage-like development sequence, but you can actually link Kohlberg's theory and other theories that are developmental in their ways of thinking about elements of this to understand also some of the civic learning outcomes. But I think more importantly is these are areas that can be even further expanded and can be the focus of outcomes assessment. Mapping survey measures to some of these dimensions, using student portfolios and also course rubrics to be able to tap into some of these civic learning dimensions. So let me go through them. So development of the self is very important. Students are developing their identity at this phase. They're developing their sense of purpose. We want to ensure that. But we also want them to discover their voice. That is, the development of self is very important in this element. We also think a lot about communities and cultures, ensuring that students develop empathy with diverse communities, not sympathy, that they actually can see themselves and that we are in this together as part of these communities, and that they begin to transcend their own embedded worldviews. And they also recognize that there are vast inequalities that actually result in underserved communities. Understanding that component is really important. We want them to understand knowledge, that it is socially constructed, and we want them to achieve information literacy. That is, the ability to actually distinguish between different forms of authority, for example, scientific evidence, and understanding the different levels of sources that are important, particularly when it comes to now the internet. But we also want them to develop a deep knowledge of the major and also some of the major debates that are encompassed in their field and disciplines. Another element of this are student skills. And we can think broadly of a whole range of skills, from active listening, which are very important in kind of negotiation and discussing controversial issues, which I'll come back to in a minute. But really thinking about conflict resolution skills, collaboration with diverse communities, community building. Again, we're thinking about, we are in this together. Then also developing values, to develop democratic aspirations, to want actually to be engaged with influencing the political structure or actually having some type of influence socially, but also developing ethical and moral reasoning and a concern for the public good, which is an element of our democracy. As I said, public action is the one we typically think about, participation, democratic processes and structures, but I also want to say ally behaviors to get engaged and solve important problems. So we can think of public action as actually important behaviors that we want to monitor. So these are some of the multiple dimensions of civic learning. As we expand them, we can think of not just volunteer or service learning contributing to some of these, but also a whole range of other activities we do during college to really think about, yes, we're engaging students and we're building their civic learning capacities. So how do we reach more students? And I want to talk a little bit about this because actually I want to say I got a little pushback from our committee on the that we developed in undergraduate education in really thinking about what are we doing next in terms of undergraduate education. And that is, I contend that all faculty can kind of mirror democratic processes in the classroom. That is, well, we expect some of this learning to occur in service learning courses and community engagement. We also can actually adopt some of the practices in our typical teaching. And so I want to say that I rely on our colleague and activist and educator, Parker Palmer, for some of the ideas that actually echo some of the civic learning dimensions that I mentioned earlier. So he talks about the 5 habits of the heart to develop students' understanding that we're all in this together, the appreciation for the value of otherness, that is embracing difference instead of ignoring difference, the ability to hold tension and conflict in life-giving ways, which I'll return to because I would say most faculty and students are conflict avoiders, but really thinking about that differently as an opportunity to learn. We're also developing the sense of personal voice and agency and the capacity to create community. So we want to give more students an opportunity to learn democratic processes and concepts. So I'm going to use an example, and this is the Intergroup Dialogue, which is one of the pedagogies that I write about. There are others that are more aligned with the civic learning and that have been implemented, for example, civic problem solving as one of the activities. But I'm going to talk about one that I'm familiar with because then I began to see how it was possible to use this in other classrooms to develop democratic processes in a variety of classrooms. So this is another framework, and it comes from my colleague, Jimenez Uniga, and her colleagues who've developed the Intergroup Dialogue process, training facilitators to have controversial discussions and bringing together communities that have a long history of conflict to actually have these conversations. So there's a 4-stage pedagogy that's really important in thinking about this. And then I thought, wow, these 4 stages can be used in several other forms of teaching. One is building relationships and community. To think about, first people have to get to know each other and develop a bond or some kind of trust by using inclusive group dynamic techniques. making people aware of power in discussions and taking turns, but also making space for others, and then also stepping back when necessary to really actually embrace the fact that we want to hear everyone's worldview, everyone's point of view on a particular issue, even if we might disagree. In fact, I prefer, if we do disagree, we want to hear it in the classroom. We don't want everyone to be just agreeing with each other. And so we really need to build those relationships so that it becomes not just a safe space, but a brave space. A second is really building awareness about multiple social identities and group-based inequality. That is, there are multiple realities that coexist on any one campus, any one community, and really understanding that they have different forms of legitimacy, but also building that awareness so we are conscious of the fact of the power dimensions that are involved in some of these different group-based identities, and also in terms of the legitimacy they hold in particular contexts. So understanding, and then awareness, of course, of one's own power in that process is really important. Also understanding that awareness. The third is really thinking, and remember that, you know, when most people come together to have discussion of controversial issues, they jump right into this third phase without building the first two. The first two are absolutely important. So the capacity to discuss controversial topics and anticipate conflict. In fact, what I tell my students is that we expect conflict. And what do we do if we expect conflict? We do very different things. This was a very difficult thing to learn as an instructor, is that conflict is an opportunity to learn. And I think probably a little bit of that, and then also letting go for allowing processes to take place so that people resolve it. And we want to build those skills in conflict resolution. Another is, and certainly once we go through some controversial topics and we end up discussing them, trying to understand them, is we start to build alliances, understanding that there are multiple communities that need assistance and that can work, and that we want to move forward in a variety of areas. In order to do that, we need to take action. And so we plan action projects. We plan to take action with others, and that becomes part of the pedagogy, is understanding that once you build this awareness, there are many students who want to know what to do with that. Once their eyes are open and they can see inequality, they can see issues that need to be addressed, they really want to have vehicles for implementing some of the changes they wish to involve in. So really thinking about those different components, which now I incorporate in my regular teaching, not just in the intergroup dialogue training classes. And it's because then it allows, it's just really good pedagogy, and also provides space for really kind of enacting some of the democratic processes we expect. For example, one student, students were talking about the conflict, and they were, I would say, they were anxious about conflict coming up with particular topics that people were introducing, they actually wanted to talk about. And one of my students said, well, you have to trust the process. That is, we create a process in place so that we know and we expect differences and perhaps even conflict, but not all conflict is the same. Not all of them is a major crisis. A lot of these can be resolved with information and a whole range of other things. And so I think it's really thinking about managing conflict is an important component of this. So what is involved in these techniques that makes them more democratic is, one, teaching students active listening techniques to be able to hear and ask questions. Asking questions is a really important vehicle for really thinking through and trying to gain more understanding, but also preventing prejudgment of opinions and ideas, but also understanding one's assumptions, etc. So we actually practice active listening and then also asking questions. And by the way, students from high school to college, we know, using a lot of the national data sets, that students ask fewer questions in college than they actually asked in high school, partially because of the large class sizes, but we're seeing there less of it. So we have to reinvigorate that. that technique and that component. Another thing is it involves experiential education. So they don't learn about things theoretically. They're all engaged in really working through some of the issues together and learning together. Reflection is an important part of this process, giving students an opportunity to understand where they were, where they are now, what they don't understand, and providing feedback on some of that reflection is really important. And of course, we develop the process for respect of different viewpoints. And then also considering conflict as an opportunity to learn. And so I would have to say over time, I've learned so much together with my students about a whole range of topics because they have chosen them. They have chosen to choose the most controversial you can think of. And we've had great discussions. And so they're modeling the skills and they'll be able to carry those skills forward in the future. So that gives you an example of where I think part of where we can be going is many more faculty can be implementing these skills to achieve civic learning outcomes. So in conclusion, I want to say that I am humbled by all the work that all of you are doing and have done for decades. You are already engaged in civic learning, and you have done so for many years. But now thinking about what are the next stages? What's the next efforts? How do we extend our efforts to reach more students and enhance higher education's role to protect our democracy? I think this is so important now. One way is to articulate that expanded notion of civic learning, continue to invest in intentional practices, and then begin to assess elements of this, both in curricular and co-curricular contexts. One thing that we found when we mapped, for example, our surveys against the civic learning outcomes, we were able to see many outcomes and many other activities that actually contributed to some of those outcomes. So we were able to then sort of expand the list of practices that we knew were really contributing to students' social agency, their pluralistic orientation, a whole range of other measures that we developed based on the civic learning outcomes. So really, I think the next stage is really thinking about how do we teach our faculty or more faculty to engage in the development of civic learning outcomes. And that's really thinking about the teaching, thinking about some civic learning pedagogies we can put in place and help many more faculty learn. In the end, our students are our best hope for making real the promises for our democracy. And I feel very passionate about this, that I think every faculty member can do something related to extending our reach and actually enhancing civic learning. So thank you for listening today, and I hope you have a wonderful conference. All of the activities that you have devised, I've looked at the program, and it's really great to see a reinvigoration of all of our efforts. It's needed more now than ever. So good luck with your work. Thank you.